the final kick to my career didn't come in a letter. It arrived wrapped in the triumphant smile of someone who thought he'd just cleaned house. 25 years of devotion reduced to a hollow phrase about new vision. But what he didn't know was this: I was the only map to the company's beating heart, and when I walked away in silence, the countdown began. They thought I left empty-handed. In truth, I carried their lifeline in my head. Every handwritten promise, every off-the-books deal that kept this place breathing. My silence wasn't surrender, it was the sound of a trap being set. My name is Claire Donovan, and at 9:37 a.m. on a Tuesday that should have been ordinary, I watched my professional life get executed in front of 23 witnesses who couldn't meet my eyes. The quarterly strategy meeting was in full swing when Marcus Bell stood up, his Armani suit catching the morning light streaming through the 42nd floor windows. He'd been VP for exactly 6 weeks, long enough to memorize everyone's coffee orders, but not long enough to understand what actually kept Halden and Rowe Capital alive. Before we continue with the Asia-Pacific projections, Marcus announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of corporate executioners everywhere, we need to address some organizational changes. I felt it coming before he even turned my way. The room's temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Jennifer from legal shifted uncomfortably. David from acquisitions suddenly found his laptop screen fascinating. Claire, Marcus said, finally meeting my gaze with eyes that held all the warmth of a January spreadsheet. After careful consideration of our evolving corporate culture and strategic direction, we've decided your position no longer aligns with our vision moving forward. 25 years, that's 9,125 days of arriving before the security guards, of knowing which investors needed their calls returned within the hour and which could wait until Tuesday, of hand-holding nervous money through market crashes and boom cycles, all of it reduced to corporate speak so generic it could have been generated by AI. Your contributions have been valued, he continued, the past tense hanging in the air like a blade. HR has prepared a transition package. We'll need your badge and company devices by end of day. The silence that followed was exquisite. You could hear the HVAC system breathing, someone's phone vibrating against a leather portfolio, the distant ding of an elevator arriving somewhere beyond these glass walls. I counted exactly 4 seconds before I smiled, not the polite, professional smile I'd perfected over decades, but something thinner, sharper, like a scalpel catching light. Of course, I said, my voice steady as marble. I understand completely. Marcus blinked. He'd prepared for anger, tears, maybe even pleading. He hadn't prepared for this, for me gathering my leather-bound notebook with the same calm precision I'd used to guide this firm through the 2008 collapse, through the pandemic pivot, through every crisis that had threatened to sink us. I stood, smoothing my dress with deliberate care. Shall I finish the Delacroix reconciliation before I go? The quarterly authentication is due Thursday. We'll handle it internally, Marcus said, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He had no idea what the Delacroix reconciliation was. None of them did, except maybe Robert Halden himself, and he was sailing somewhere off Martha's Vineyard, blissfully unaware that his new VP had just cut out the firm's heart. I walked to the door, my heels creating a rhythm against the polished floor, measured, unhurried, final, at the threshold. I turned back, letting my gaze sweep across the room. Some of them knew, the smart ones. Anyway, Evan Brooks was pale beneath his tan. Sarah from compliance was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Marcus, I said, and he actually straightened, like a schoolboy called on by a teacher. You might want to check the authentication protocols for the Heritage Fund accounts. The old paper system has some peculiarities. His jaw tightened. We're fully digital now. Has been policy for 3 years. Of course, I repeated, and this time my smile was almost genuine, because Marcus Bell, in his 6 weeks of revolutionary leadership, had never wondered why certain filing cabinets required 2 keys, why some investor calls only came through my direct line, why Robert Halden had once called me at 2 a.m. from Tokyo just to verify a single signature. I left them there, frozen in their black leather chairs, their tablets and smartphones useless as props in a play they didn't know they were performing. The door whispered shut behind me, and I could feel their collective exhale through the glass. In the elevator, I pulled out my personal phone and deleted 17 contacts investors who only trusted my voice. Lawyers who verified millions through handshakes and paper trails. The old guard who kept their wealth flowing through this firm, not because of its algorithms or market analytics, but because Claire Donovan had never, not once in 25 years, let them down. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, I'd already begun counting down, not days or weeks, but phone calls that wouldn't be returned, authentications that wouldn't be verified, relationships that would start to fray like silk in nervous hands. They thought they were cleaning house. They were actually burning it down. And I was the only one who knew where they'd hidden the matches. 25 years at Halden and Rowe Capital had taught me that real power never announces itself. It lives in the margins, in handwritten notes, in promises sealed with bourbon instead of DocuSign. Marcus Bell, with his MBA still fresh enough to smell the printer ink, never understood that some foundations can't be digitized. I started at this firm when fax machines were revolutionary, and Robert Halden still signed every check himself. Back then, the company occupied just 3 floors of a building in the financial district, and our biggest client managed a portfolio worth less than what we now handled in a slow Tuesday. I was 23, fresh from Wellesley, hired as Robert's executive assistant when his previous one quit after exactly 1 day of his impossible demands. But I learned his language, not English, but the dialect of trust that old money speaks. Within 6 months, I wasn't just managing his calendar, I was sitting in on meetings with men who controlled fortunes older than the country itself. These were people who viewed contracts as suggestions and handshakes as blood oaths. Robert noticed how they responded to me. How Theodore Ashford would only discuss his family trust when I was in the room. How Margaret Delacroix insisted I personally verify every quarterly statement. "Claire," Robert had said one evening in 1999, as we worked through the night on an acquisition that would triple our holdings. "Some people think business is about numbers. It's not. It's about knowing which promises matter and who keeps them." That night, he handed me a brass key. "Second filing cabinet, bottom drawer. Everything that really matters is in there. Not the digital records, not the official documents, the real agreements." Over the years, that single drawer became a room, then a series of cabinets, then an entire system visible only to those who knew where to look. While the firm modernized, automated, digitized, I maintained the shadow network that actually kept us alive. The Delacroix family's handwritten amendment allowing us to manage their European holdings never digitized because Margaret didn't trust computers. The Pemberton proxy agreements, renewed every year with a phone call and a signature on paper that had to be physically mailed to their attorney in Boston. The side letter guaranteeing the Hashimoto Group's investments would never be leveraged beyond 30%, typed on an actual typewriter because Mr. Hashimoto believed contracts should be permanent as carved stone. Each piece of paper represented not just money, but relationships cultivated over decades. When Margaret Delacroix's son died in 2012, I was the one who flew to Paris for the funeral, who knew to bring white orchids, not lilies, who understood that business would not be discussed for exactly 40 days of mourning. When Theodore Ashford had his stroke, I knew his daughter Patricia would only trust financial decisions if they came with my personal verification, a system we'd worked out through nothing more than a nod and a handshake in a hospital corridor. Marcus and his optimization team saw inefficiency where I saw architecture. They saw outdated methods where I saw the actual skeleton holding up a $2 billion operation. In their rush to modernize, they never asked the essential question, why did some of our biggest investors still insist on paper? Because paper was personal. Paper was proof that could be held, locked away, retrieved by someone you trusted. Paper didn't update automatically, didn't sync to the cloud, didn't leave digital footprints for competitors to trace. Paper was a promise you could touch. The authentication protocol, as I'd named it in my own mind, wasn't written anywhere. It existed in my knowledge of which documents needed to be physically signed, which required witness verification from specific law firms, which had to be mailed to addresses that weren't listed in any corporate directory. I knew that the Yamamoto account required a verification stamp from a specific bank in Tokyo that only processed requests on Wednesdays. I knew the Brennan Trust needed quarterly photos of physical documents because Old Man Brennan had been burned by digital fraud in 2001 and never trusted a screen again. Robert knew all of this. Once, but 5 years ago, When his wife got sick, he'd started stepping back, trusting me to handle what he called the old world obligations. When she died last year, he'd retreated even further, spending more time on his boat than in the office, confident that the machine would run itself. He never imagined someone like Marcus Bell would come in, see me as redundancy in his lean operational model, and cut me loose without understanding that I wasn't just an employee, I was the institutional memory of every unwritten rule that kept our oldest, richest clients from walking away. The irony was perfect, really. Marcus thought he was eliminating inefficiency. Instead, he'd just deleted the only translation guide between two worlds, one where wealth moved at the speed of trust, and another where he believed everything could be reduced to ones and zeros. As I stood in my home office that afternoon, looking at my personal files, copies of nothing official, of course, but notes, reminders, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be transferred in a 2-week transition, I wondered how long it would take them to realize what they'd lost. Not long, I thought, checking my calendar. The Delacroix authentication was due Thursday. The Pemberton renewal letter needed to be mailed by Friday to reach Boston by the Monday deadline. The Yamamoto verification window was next Wednesday. One by one, the dominoes I'd spent 25 years carefully arranging would start to fall, and Marcus Bell wouldn't even know what hit him. The security guard, Thomas, had worked the building for 15 years. He watched me pack with the kind of careful attention reserved for someone dismantling a bomb. 25 years compressed into 3 banker's boxes. That's all that remained visible of my tenure at Halden and Rowe. "Ms. Donovan," Thomas said quietly, "this ain't right." I placed a framed photo of Robert Halden and me at the 2010 Children's Hospital Gala into the first box. We'd raised $4 million that night, mostly because I knew exactly which investors had kids who'd been patients there. Right rarely has anything to do with business. Thomas. My former office was a corner unit on the 38th floor. Not because of prestige, but because Robert wanted me close enough to reach, but far enough to maintain the necessary distance between official and unofficial business. I moved methodically, taking the ceramic pen holder my daughter made in 3rd grade, the leather-bound notebooks filled with my personal observations, the Mont Blanc pen Robert gave me after we secured the Ashford account. What I didn't take was far more interesting. In the bottom drawer of my desk, I left a locked metal box, its key conspicuously absent. Inside was nothing but a single sheet of paper with 7 dates written in my handwriting. No context, no explanation. Just dates ranging from next Thursday to 6 weeks from now. Marcus would find it, of course. He'd obsess over it, try to decode it, maybe even hire someone to investigate what those dates meant. He'd never guess they were random, meaningless, a ghost I was leaving behind to haunt his efficiency metrics. On my bulletin board, I'd maintained what looked like a chaotic collection of business cards, Post-its, and newspaper clippings. To anyone else, it was office detritus. To me, it was a map of the shadow network, every contact who operated outside normal channels, every lawyer who knew about the handshake deals, every assistant who could verify signatures from memory. I photographed it with my personal phone, then took it down piece by piece, dropping each item into the shredder with deliberate precision. "You taking the filing cabinet keys?" Thomas asked, noticing the brass ring I'd worn on my belt for 2 decades. "Company property," I replied, placing them in a white envelope marked for Marcus's attention. What I didn't mention was that I'd had copies made years ago, not for any nefarious purpose, but because Robert had a habit of losing his set. The copies were in my home safe, next to backup drives that contained nothing official, nothing that belonged to the firm, just my personal notes about client preferences, anniversary dates, the names of grandchildren, dietary restrictions for dinner meetings, the human intelligence that made relationships work. Sarah from compliance appeared in my doorway at 3:45 p.m., her face tight with worry. "Claire, the Brennan Trust folder Marcus had facilities move the old filing cabinets to storage. He says everything's been digitized, but the Brennan Trust specifically prohibits digital storage of their documentation," I finished. "Yes, I know." What do I tell Marcus? I aligned the edges of papers on my empty desk, a gesture of order in the coming chaos. Tell him the truth. He values transparency, doesn't he? Sarah's laugh was bitter. He values metrics. Speaking of which, he's already assigned your accounts to the algorithmic management team, says personal handling is an outdated redundancy. The algorithmic management team, 3 kids from MIT who believed every financial decision could be reduced to patterns and probabilities. They'd never sat with Patricia Ashford while she cried about her father's memory loss. Never knew that she only moved money on Tuesdays because that was the day her father used to review accounts. They wouldn't know that Samuel Delacroix required a phone call on the anniversary of his son's death. Not about business, but just to hear that someone remembered. I sealed the last box and stood, surveying the space that had been mine for the last decade. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like falling empires. "There's something else," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "The Heritage Fund authentication, Marcus doesn't know it exists. It's not in any of the digital records." "No," I agreed. "It wouldn't be." The Heritage Fund was Robert's masterpiece, a collection of investments from 7 families who'd backed him when he had nothing but ambition and a rented desk. They operated on principles older than the SEC, older than modern banking law. Their agreements were sealed with wax, witnessed by specific law firms, and required physical authentication every quarter. Miss one authentication, and they had the right to withdraw everything nearly $800 million within 72 hours. "When is it due?" Sarah asked, though her face suggested she already knew. "Thursday, 2 p.m. The documents need to be hand-delivered to Whitman and Associates on State Street. Mr. Whitman will be expecting them." "But if Marcus doesn't know?" "Then I suggest someone tells him." I picked up my boxes, balancing them with practiced ease. "Though you might want to wait until Wednesday. Give him time to settle into his new efficient system." As I walked through the cubicle maze toward the elevators, conversations stopped. Some people looked away. Others nodded small acknowledgments of what was happening. Evan Brooks stood as I passed, a gesture of respect that belonged to another era. At the elevator, I turned back one last time. The office hummed with its usual energy phones ringing, keyboards clicking, deals being made and unmade. But underneath, I could already sense the tremor, the first invisible crack in the foundation. I left the building at 4:27 p.m., walking past the spot where I'd stood 25 years ago, young and eager, believing I was joining something permanent. Thomas held the door, and I could see the question in his eyes. Would I be back? I smiled, shifted my boxes, and walked into the afternoon heat. Behind me, Halden and Rowe Capital continued its daily race toward efficiency, optimization, digitization. They wouldn't notice the first missed deadline until Thursday. By then, I'd be untouchable, unreachable, and absolutely unnecessary until they realized I was the only one who could fix what was about to break. Thursday arrived with the kind of pristine morning that made Boston's financial district gleam like a promise. I sat in my kitchen, watching the clock turn from 9:59 to 10 a.m., knowing that somewhere across the city, the first deadline had just passed unnoticed. The Delacroix authentication required a specific form, printed on letterhead that Margaret Delacroix had personally approved in 1998, signed with blue ink, never black, and delivered to their family attorney before noon on the first Thursday of each quarter. The form wasn't in any digital template library. It existed in a single manila folder that I'd kept in the third filing cabinet, clearly labeled Delacroix Quarterly, but Marcus had ordered those cabinets moved to storage, their contents deemed redundant after the Great Digitization Initiative. At 10:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. Evan Brooks. "Did you handle the Delacroix forms before you left?" I didn't respond. Professional courtesy extended only so far. By noon, I knew the second deadline had passed. The Pemberton renewal letter, a single page that needed to reach Boston by Monday, hadn't been mailed. The template existed only in my personal files, crafted over years to include specific language the Pemberton's legal team required. Without it, they'd assume we'd abandoned our management agreement, $800 million in assets, gone because no one knew to mail a letter. Marcus, I imagined, was probably in another optimization meeting, reviewing metrics that showed improved efficiency across all departments. Digital response times were up. Paper usage was down 70%. He'd probably even created a PowerPoint slide about it. one of those sleek presentations with animated graphs that rose like monuments to progress. At 2:37 p.m., my phone rang. Sarah from compliance. Claire, I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't work there anymore, Sarah. A pause. Right. Of course. It's just, Marcus found your locked box. He's convinced it's some kind of key to something important. He's had 3 people trying to match those dates to delivery schedules, contract deadlines, everything. I smiled, stirring honey into my tea. How thorough of him. Claire, the Heritage Fund, is due at 2 p.m. It's now past 2:30 p.m. Oh, God. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He doesn't know. No one told him. We just found out an hour ago when Whitman's office called asking where their courier was. Whitman and Associates had been verifying Heritage Fund documents since before Marcus was born. They didn't do email reminders or courtesy calls. They simply noted the missed deadline and initiated the withdrawal protocol, a beautiful, archaic process that would take exactly 72 hours to drain $800 million from Halden and Rose management. Marcus is in crisis mode, Sarah continued. He's saying it's impossible, that everything was digitized, that there must be electronic copies. There are no electronic copies, I said simply. The Heritage Fund families specifically forbid it. It's in their original agreement. He wants to know. He's asking if you might have taken something when you left. Now I laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. Sarah, I took 3 boxes of personal items under security supervision. Thomas can verify every item. I didn't take a single piece of company property. That was true. I hadn't taken anything. I'd simply left behind a system that required me to function, like removing the keystone from an arch and walking away while everyone insisted the structure was still sound. He's called an emergency meeting for 4 p.m., Sarah said. All senior staff. He's demanding to know why these protocols weren't in the transition documents. They were never in transition documents because they weren't official protocols. They were relationships, understandings, patterns of trust built over decades. How do you document that Patricia Ashford only accepts financial advice on Tuesdays? How do you digitize the fact that Samuel Delacroix needs to hear a human voice confirm his holdings every quarter because his son died in a trading floor accident and he never trusted screens again? There's more, Sarah whispered. The Yamamoto verification is next Wednesday. The Brennan Trust photos are due tomorrow, and something about the Hashimoto leverage agreement, no one can find any record of it. Each missing piece was another support beam failing, another crack spreading through Marcus's efficient new structure. By my count, they were about to lose not just the Heritage Fund, but potentially another $2 billion in assets from investors who valued handshakes over hashtags, paper over pixels, tradition over transformation. Sarah, I said, setting down my tea, did Marcus ever ask why certain clients insisted on paper documentation? He said it was generational resistance to change, said we needed to educate them about our digital security protocols. Of course he did, Marcus Bell. 6 weeks into his revolution, thought he could educate families who'd been managing wealth since before his great-grandfather was born. He thought efficiency was always improvement, that faster was always better, that everything old was automatically obsolete. Good luck with the meeting, I said, and ended the call. At 4 p.m., I knew Marcus would be standing in the conference room, demanding answers from a team that didn't even know the right questions. He'd be looking at Sarah, at Evan, at the senior staff who'd watched me leave without protest, and he'd be realizing that the silence they'd maintained wasn't agreement, it was fear. My phone buzzed again. 3 missed calls from Halden and Rose main line, 2 texts from Evan, 1 voicemail from a number I recognized as Marcus's direct line. I deleted them all without reading, without listening. They'd made their choice in that conference room Tuesday morning, sitting in silence while Marcus executed 25 years of institutional knowledge for the crime of being inefficiently human. Tomorrow, the Brennan Trust would withdraw. Monday, the Pembertons would initiate their exit. By Wednesday, when the Yamamoto verification failed, the avalanche would be unstoppable. I poured another cup of tea and opened my personal laptop, checking the news. Nothing yet, but soon, the financial press would notice massive withdrawals from one of Boston's most prestigious firms. They'd speculate about mismanagement, about market volatility, about anything except the truth that Marcus Bell had fired the woman who knew which promises were written in ink and which were written in trust. The clock on my kitchen wall ticked toward 5 p.m. In another life, I'd be preparing the Friday morning reports, double-checking the weekend contact list, making sure every handwritten note was in place for Monday's openings. Instead, I sat in perfect stillness, counting down the hours until Marcus Bell would understand that some things can't be optimized, some relationships can't be digitized, and some knowledge can't be transferred in a 2-week transition plan. The foundation was crumbling, and I was the only one who knew where they'd stored the blueprints. But those blueprints were written in a language Marcus Bell had deemed obsolete, in the careful script of human connection that no algorithm could decode. Friday morning arrived wrapped in rain, the kind that turned Boston's glass towers into watercolor paintings. At 8:23 a.m., my phone lit up with a text from Evan Brooks. Found Brennan Trust warning letter. Marcus ignored it. Can we talk? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I made breakfast scrambled eggs, sourdough toast, the luxury of time that unemployment afforded. But I knew Evan, knew he'd been at Halden and Rowe for 12 years, knew he had 2 kids in college and a mortgage that demanded his silence when it mattered. He'd sat in that room Tuesday, watching my execution, saying nothing. Yet now, with the walls beginning to crack, he'd found his voice. At 9:15 a.m., another text. Claire, this is bigger than the Brennan Trust. Internal audit found 17 accounts with special requirements, no documentation. Marcus called them legacy inefficiencies in yesterday's meeting. Legacy inefficiencies. That's what 25 years of relationship building had become in Marcus's vocabulary. Mrs. Hashimoto's requirement that documents be sent to her Kyoto address during cherry blossom season, because her late husband had proposed under those trees. The Forrester family's insistence on quarterly meetings in person, because their patriarch had been swindled in an online scam. Theodore Ashford's demand for handwritten summaries because screens gave him migraines after his stroke. At 10 a.m., my phone rang. This time, I answered. Evan. Jesus. Claire. His voice was strained, the carefully modulated tone of someone speaking from a conference room phone booth. It's falling apart. The Brennan Trust pulled everything at 9 a.m. $300 million. Gone. Marcus tried to call them, but they won't speak to anyone except me. Their lawyer said you were the only authorized representative. Said it's been that way for 15 years. I'd earned that authorization the hard way, sitting with old man Brennan through his wife's cancer, knowing when to talk business and when to simply be present. His lawyers had my personal number, my home address, my handwriting on file. Marcus had my corporate email, now deactivated, and an empty desk. There's more, Evan continued. Sarah found a storage unit receipt in your old office. Marcus thinks you've hidden documents there. I almost laughed. The storage unit contains my daughter's college furniture. Evan, I've had it for 3 years. He doesn't believe that. He's convinced you've taken something, hidden some key that would fix all this. He's talking about legal action, corporate espionage charges. Now I did laugh, sharp and bright. Corporate espionage. I left with 3 boxes under security supervision, every item cataloged. What I didn't take, Evan, was my memory, my knowledge, the relationships I built before Marcus learned to spell optimization. Claire, he's desperate. The Heritage Fund withdrawal process started this morning. $800 million. If that completes, it will complete. Whitman and Associates doesn't reverse position. They haven't since 1962. I heard him breathing. Could picture him in one of those glass phone booths, watching the rain streak down windows that framed an empire beginning to crumble. There's something else, he said, voice dropping lower. Robert Halden is flying back from Martha's Vineyard. His assistant called looking for you. Said Robert wants to speak with you before he arrives at the office Monday morning. Robert, of course. Someone had finally reached him on his boat. Probably with news that his life's work was hemorrhaging nearly $1 billion in 72 hours. He'd want answers. He'd want to know how his hand-picked VP had managed to destroy in 3 days what had taken decades to build. Tell Robert's assistant I'm unavailable, I said. Claire. I don't work there anymore. Remember Marcus made that quite clear in front of 23 witnesses. This is beyond Marcus now. This is about saving the firm. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the rain paint rivers on the glass. The firm made its choice. Evan, every one of you sat in that room and let it happen. You knew what I did, knew what I handled, knew the relationships I maintained, and you sat silent while Marcus called me a redundancy. You thought your silence would buy you safety. You thought Marcus's efficiency metrics would somehow compensate for losing the person who knew which foundations would crack first. A pause, then, how bad is this going to get? I did the math in my head, the terrible arithmetic of relationship collapse. By Monday, you'll have lost $1.3 billion in withdrawals. By Wednesday, when the Yamamoto verification fails, add another $400 million. By month's end, when 7 more authentication deadlines pass unmet, you're looking at close to $3 billion in managed assets walking out the door. $3 billion, his voice was hollow. That's over half our holdings. 58%, actually. Christ, Marcus keeps saying everything was digitized, that the records must exist somewhere. He's had the MIT team working through the night, scanning servers, checking backups. They can scan until their eyes bleed. You can't digitize a handshake. Evan, you can't upload trust. You can't automate the human moment when someone decides their money is safe with you. Would you... He stopped, started again. If Robert asked, if he personally asked you to come back, would you consider it? I thought about Tuesday morning, about Marcus's practice speech, about the words, no longer aligns with our vision. I thought about walking past 23 silent colleagues who'd worked with me for years, some for over a decade. Not one voice raised in question or protest. What would I come back to? Evan, to work under Marcus, to pretend Tuesday didn't happen, to rebuild what he'll just tear down again the next time he reads a book about disruptive innovation. Marcus won't survive this, you know that. Yes, I knew that. By Monday afternoon, Robert would understand the full scope of the catastrophe. By Tuesday, Marcus Bell would be updating his LinkedIn profile. But that wasn't vindication, it was just mathematics. Cause and effect. The inevitable conclusion of firing someone whose value you never bothered to understand. I have to go, I said. Claire, please, just think about it. People's jobs are at stake here. Good people. Good people who stayed silent, I reminded him. Goodbye, Evan. I ended the call and turned off my phone. Let them navigate the storm they'd welcomed with their silence. Let them explain to Robert how they'd watched his firm's memory walk out the door carrying nothing but personal items and everything that mattered. Outside, the rain intensified, and I thought about Mrs. Hashimoto in Kyoto, waiting for documents that would never arrive, about Old Man Brennan's trust, broken by people who didn't even know his first name, about all the careful promises I'd kept for 25 years, now shattered by a man who thought efficiency was just another word for progress. The foundation hadn't just cracked, it was collapsing in real time. Each failed deadline, another support beam splintering, another relationship severed, another fortune walking away from Halden and Rowe Capital. And I sat in my kitchen, dry and warm, counting down the hours until Monday morning when Robert Halden would arrive at his firm to find it hollowed out, efficient and empty, optimized into obsolescence. Saturday passed in deceptive calm, but Sunday brought the storm. At 7:43 p.m., as I was reading in my study, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Robert Halden himself, rain-soaked despite his umbrella, looking every one of his 71 years. I didn't open the door immediately. Let him wait. I thought, the way I'd waited in that conference room for someone, anyone, to speak up. After 30 seconds, I relented. Robert. Claire. His voice carried exhaustion deeper than jet lag. May I come in? I stepped aside. He entered, expensive shoes leaving wet prints on my hardwood floor. His usual commanding presence diminished to something almost fragile. I didn't offer to take his coat, didn't offer coffee. This wasn't a social call. I got the call from Samuel Delacroix yesterday, he said without preamble. He was, upset is too mild a word. He used terms I haven't heard since my Navy days. 800 million. Claire. His family's entire trust, gone because we missed a quarterly authentication. You didn't miss it. Marcus Bell dismissed it as a redundancy. Robert's jaw tightened. Marcus Bell is an idiot who convinced me he could bring us into the future. But you... He stopped, collected himself. You knew this would happen.
Yes. And you let it.
I moved to my window, looking out at the rain-washed street. On Tuesday, your hand-picked VP stood in front of your senior staff and announced I was no longer aligned with the company's vision. 23 people who'd worked with me for years sat in silence. You were sailing off Martha's Vineyard. Tell me, Robert, what exactly should I have done?
You could have warned me.
Why? When during the 2 minutes Marcus gave me to process being fired, during the supervised packing of my office, or perhaps I should have called you on your boat to explain that your new VP was about to destroy everything we built. He sank into my leather chair without invitation, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. The Brennan Trust, the Pembertons, the Heritage Fund. Sarah gave me the list. We're looking at $3 billion in withdrawals by month's end. $3.2 billion, if the Yamamoto verification fails Wednesday. Christ. He rubbed his face with both hands. 40 years of building this firm, and it takes less than a week to destroy it. I said nothing. The math was speaking loudly enough. Marcus found your locked box, he said, looking up at me. 7 dates. He's convinced there's some kind of key. They're nothing. Random dates. A ghost for him to chase while Rome burns. A bitter laugh escaped him. You played him. I gave him exactly what he expected to find: a mystery. A problem to optimize. He's probably got a team analyzing those dates right now instead of trying